Welcome to the Rule of Life podcast. Today, we're going to hear a story of how the practice of generosity shows up in the everyday lives of real people. Now, Jesus commands us to be generous to the poor. This week, we'll hear Josh and Abbi Porter's journey of living that out.
Hi, I'm Josh. This is my wife, Abbi, and we live in Vancouver, Washington.
We have been married for 17 years, and we have 3 kids. We have 10-year-old Beck, 8-year-old Isla, and 2-year-old Arlo.
Well, I think our theology of generosity, financing, budget was a natural outgrowth of circumstance. We had spent years operating at kind of the American poverty line because of lifestyle. I was a traveling musician and season of life. It was the right time to do it, both really young and before we had kids. And we survived on very, very little and didn't really think much about it. We figured we had what we needed, and we were able to do the things that we felt were important for us to do. When that season of life changed, and when I got a different job, and when we weren't as impoverished as we had been, that kind of essential frugality followed us from one season to the next. And when you learn to live with very, very little, and you don't have any excess at all, for years of our marriage, there was kind of like, there's enough to pay rent and to get groceries, and then that's it. And we were quite happy. So when that is your standard and suddenly there is excess, I think we were fortunate that we had already been forced by circumstance to learn what it means to live without excess. And so excess truly felt like excess. It just feels like we have extra now. We don't actually need it. I remember vividly the period of my very first paycheck as a church employee. I had gone from kind of self-employed musician to working at a church with all the grown-up, trappings of now you have these paperwork to fill out and a check comes in the mail and Abbi and I had always had a budget. She's extremely organized, and both of us had a general disposition of frugality, but we were looking at what now seems like a hilariously small amount of money. It was minimum wage, which was smaller than it is now. So it wasn't a tremendous amount of money, and it was still operating at the poverty line. But to us, it seemed ridiculous. It seemed like way more money than we needed. And so we had to sit down and go like, where is this going to go? And now we have more money for this. And I felt a sense of kind of dark excitement that I was like, I could get stuff. I could buy stuff for me. And I started to excitedly unfold all these possibilities before Abbi, like, we could buy this thing and I could get this thing. And she was kind of slowing me down. Well, okay, but is that really what we want to do with the money, the extra money? We never did that before. And what does that mean? We should think through it thoughtfully. And we started to evaluate the possibility of the two of us having an allowance from the page. So it's after we've spent this much on our bills and this much on the necessity groceries, that kind of thing. Maybe you could have $20 a month and I could have $20 a month, and you could get what you want with that $20 a month. And I remember feeling immediately, before I'd spent anything, before I had even intellectually allocated those funds, as if that's not enough. I can't do anything with $20 a month. Whereas for years of our marriage prior to that point, we had $0 a month for allowance, fun money. We didn't even go out to eat or anything like that. And suddenly I'd gone from, that's totally fine, that's just the life that we live, to it's not enough. And I felt this intense conviction of the Spirit that's like, that's not enough. You've had nothing. And your first thought is, how can you spend this extra bit of money on yourself? Like, you don't even want to think about where else this money could go. And I remember where we were in our room and having that conversation about, are we really going to spend all the money that we could spend on ourselves, or is it going to go anywhere else? And that's actually the first time we ever had a conversation about what does it look like to have a generosity line in our budget. The first time we set it out, the idea was, and it was mostly Abby's brilliance, was that you have all these necessities as adults. And by necessities, I mean things like rent, groceries, the things that you need for basic survival. But then we realized very quickly that a lot of the things that we defined as necessities were actually luxuries, things like cell phones, streaming services, the things that we don't need or they're not necessary, but we choose to have them. And so we broke those two things into two separate categories. The things that we have to have, rent and groceries, and then the things that we choose to have, things like cell phones or streaming services or going out to eat a budget for, dates. And that second category, that's the stuff that we're spending on ourselves. We choose to spend this money on ourselves, to go out to eat, to be able to watch movies. And so Abby's idea was to have a third category for generosity and for that number to be higher than the second category so that we could actually look at the budget and quantifiably say we're spending more money on other people than we spend on ourselves, because generosity becomes this difficult idea to quantify. And we didn't want it to become this kind of loose concept that we say, hey, we're basically generous. We give to our church, and every now and then we think of some charitable organization to which we might donate, that kind of thing. Or we sponsor a kid. We wanted to be able to say, are we being generous, or are we honoring the idea that Jesus argued that it's actually better to give things away than it is to receive things, and to be able to say, at least on paper, in our budget, the number of that represents what we give away is higher than the number that we keep for ourselves. And that became the generosity line in the budget.
It is important to involve our kids because kids are not naturally generous. I guess humans aren't naturally generous, maybe, but especially kids. So we take our kids to buy presents for kids in our city that wouldn't have toys on Christmas. And we always try to pick kids around our same kids' age so that they are picking something that they want but don't get to keep. And I think it's good for them to learn at this age, and it's fun to involve them in that way.
There was one of the first Christmas seasons that we actually talked about bringing our very young kids at the time into the process of what does it mean to have them shop for someone else for Christmas, especially someone that they don't even know, that they just will understand conceptually. This is a kid that won't have a gift unless we get it for them. And I think that there was a local toy drive. It wasn't even that specifically organized a thing. My son and I, he was very young at the time. He was our only kid. The two of us walked into a department store or some such place with ulterior motives. We were on a quick, practical run, saw the toy drive, and I had a brief conversation with him about the concept of a toy drive and what it means and why. And I remember his face when he first comprehended the idea that there are kids who won't get Christmas presents. It was just this grave, somber, his countenance fell. And I remember being especially moved by his empathy. He loves the ideas of getting toys for Christmas, and he just understood for the first time there are kids who don't get any toys for Christmas for various reasons, and what a tragedy that is. And he was almost desperate to get a gift for this kid. It was almost as if he had, in his heart, adopted this kid that he didn't even understand, and was like, well, it has to be something like this. It has to be really good. And he took me through the toy aisles, and he pointed to me all the different dinosaurs that he would like. This kid might like the same kind. And I remember we picked it out thoughtfully, maybe too thoughtfully. It took a long time. And we went and we put it in the big toy drive basket together. And we stood there for a second. I remember pointing at it and being like, and now, because you decided to go spend time on this and get this for this kid, and we're going to use what we have to get it for this kid's going to have this, on Christmas, and he wouldn't otherwise. And yeah, it's a toy. It's not the end of the world, but isn't that awesome? And And he had this kind of what I sense to be deep satisfaction over it. Like kids have, especially when they're that small, they haven't yet learned to fabricate smiles, and they haven't learned pretense yet. So he was so happy the whole way home. He couldn't wait to come home and tell Abbi about the entire process of picking it out, and telling her as if she's never heard of the concept of what a toy drive. Let me explain a toy drive to you, Mom, and everything. And remembering what an easy sell it was, that it didn't require any kind of sophisticated theologizing. It was just, this is something that we can do for someone else. And isn't that incredible? And having the opportunity to be like, that's why Jesus said this crazy thing that he said. It's actually better to give things away than it is to get them for yourself. And believing in that moment that was actually something that a 5-year-old could wrap their minds around.
I think that one of the things that I can specifically call back to is, this sounds like a silly story, but we had gotten a new car, new to us, not brand new. It's not a super nice car, but it felt nice and new to us. And I remember someone asked to borrow our car, and I kind of felt oh, this is our nice new car. I don't really want to let someone borrow it, and was so convicted by the Spirit that this is not your stuff. You have been given stuff to share, to be generous with. And if that means that people need to use your stuff, you need to hold that with open hands, because it's truly not yours to begin with. And yeah, from that time forward, I mean, obviously it's an ongoing reminder, but that anything that we have, from little things to bigger things to actual money to time, is that all of it is borrowed, and to give generously with what we have.
In Abbi and I's micro community of accountability, we have created rules. Sounds like a really strong word for it, but essentially rules by which we spend money, and they sound hardcore to, I guess, some folks, but we essentially don't buy things for ourselves just because, under any circumstances. So the things that we get for ourselves for fun come through things like gift-giving occasions, or saved up gift cards from Christmas, that kind of thing. It would be if I suddenly went out and, I don't know what I would buy, but if I went out and bought myself a new movie collection and came home and she'd be like, what in the world are you doing? And that's the kind of environment that we've created over time, and not because we're so awesome at simplicity, but because we're so vulnerable to materialism. And I'm sure, it could look different for any given family, but for us, the idea that this is how we will spend money on ourselves when and if we spend money on ourselves has been kind of discussed, established, agreed upon between the two of us, and we know that there's accountability within that paradigm. Keeps either one of us from kind of giving in to that gravitational pull of, I'll just get this, because we answer to one another and we're accountable to one another.
Accountability, whether that's within your family or friends or however you want to do it, is a big thing. I think the even bigger thing is telling your mind to not want things. It's one thing to just not buy things. The thing that I've been trying to actively work on in myself is to actually not believe that the lie that I would be happier if I had this.
I don't know how many people actually just believe on paper what Jesus said. It's better to give things away than it is to keep them for yourself. I don't know how many of us can just intellectually concede to that idea without practicing it. But then if you do practice it, I think most people know what this means, that there's a sense in your soul, and there's a sense superficially that it feels good. And there is something better about that. There is something better about giving than receiving. But unfortunately, it's not something you practice once, learn, and then are entirely convinced of. You only learn it and relearn it and relearn it by a lifestyle of practice. The only reason that we're able to try to communicate to our kids what it means to practice restraint and then be contented is from the experiential evidence. Like, we've done it and we were fine. In fact, we actually feel better, like it's one less thing to preoccupy our already distracted minds. But even in something as difficult and counterintuitive culturally as generosity and simplicity, it's amazing that, like Abby said, you experience joy for yourself. When what an incredible gesture from God that this act of self-sacrificial love, even small ones, creates in you a sense of satisfaction, a sense of joy, that it's not the kind of practice that you have to carry out begrudgingly, that God is after your joy in the truest sense. And that when Jesus said it's better to give things away than receive, he's talking about justice, he's talking about equity, of course, but he's also talking about you and your joy. You will be a person of joyful contentment if you practice what Jesus said.